All right. Um, Instead of having people come up and do boring staid talks, we've gone the format of doing fireside conversations, and I'm absolutely delighted at our first fireside keynote chat, Mr. Jay Shekawat, who is well known to many in the community. Come on up, Jay. Absolutely, sit down. And again, a resume way too long to summarize, but suffice to say, a history of success in founding, in building, scaling, and selling companies over the career. And then what I love about the very strong list of accomplishments that you've had, that you basically then turned your calendar over to the Chicago community. I mean, in a sense that you said, you know, I've done whatever I needed to do, and please grab one. And you've
saying this.
And you've said, well, how can I help you? And as a board member of 1871, and as a mentor, formal and informal, from people in the community, I know you, even beyond the listed number of companies that you help nurture, you've just taken that as your life's mission. Talk about that a bit, if you could, please.
Well, thank you for starting with that. Actually, so you know, I stumbled upon entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. So I'm not you know, someone who came from an entrepreneurial family. I grew up in a Navy family, actually, in India, and both my grandfathers were Army men, and my brother was a naval aviator. So in a sense, you know, you can see who the black sheep of the family was here. But along the way, I discovered entrepreneurship. And I think the way I arrived at it, it's become clear to me that it's more of a discipline than something that you're born into.
So one of the things you say, and it's on the billboards, is that Howard taught you the entrepreneurial gospel. What do you mean by that?
You know, so when I came to Kellogg, that was 2 decades ago, I had a stint working for a very successful Gujarati entrepreneur in Detroit. His gentleman's name was Bharat Desai. He's gone. The husband and wife team, they became like elder brother and sister to me, and I learned a lot from them. But the lessons there were relatively transactional, and they were quite basic. And you know, he was excellent at managing cash flow, and there were some lessons there. But when I sat in Howard's class, you know, I remember Howard asking for a show of hands on who wants to be an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. And I actually I wasn't really clear what that meant. Right. And so lots of people raised their hand, and I guess it was sort of the sexy thing to do. And I was at the back, and I'm like, I don't really know. I just want to join McKinsey. This
was in the 90s? Or?
This was in, yes, the late 90s. Thank you for pointing out the
No, I'm not suggesting. No. Trust me, I think I'm older than you.
We won't go there.
No, we won't go there.
But you know, from the way Howard comes at it, and he was already a successful entrepreneur back then, but he's a teacher too. Right. And I think at his heart he's a teacher. Mm-hmm. And the way he laid out you know, what I think of as the discipline of entrepreneurship. So he was able to take the classroom theory and the academics and allow someone like me who had actually had an entrepreneurial journey, it was just someone else's journey, and stitch all of those things together to the point where when I left Kellogg, I didn't start something right away. I wanted to join McKinsey. But that combined with the McKinsey experience, there came a moment where you just sort of, it all falls into place and you feel like you have all the tools, you know, to do something. And then what is entrepreneurship at its heart? Now I can speak off it with some knowledge, actually. But it's a way of looking at the world differently from, say, a manager. You know, a manager looks at the world and says, well, if I have this much of a budget and this many people, then I can do X. Whereas an entrepreneur actually doesn't have any people or a budget. So they look at the world as, what is the size of the opportunity? And then I'll go get the people and the money, right? So a manager says, tell me how much money I have, how many people I have, then I'll tell you what I can do. An entrepreneur says, tell me the size of the opportunity, I'll get the other two things. And it's a simple switch in your mind, but you know, I'm not sure who first said this, but an idea that festers in our minds that just creates a sense of dissatisfaction, that's actually the only force of anything in the world.
True.
You know, whether it's MLK or Mandela or Gandhi or Steve Jobs or any one of us, nothing happens unless you have an idea that is disconnected from the reality you see outside, and you just want to bridge the gap. That's what a company is, right? That is all a company is.
So tell us the first idea. You've had a series of companies, and I didn't know one of them was in Naperville, which is where I live. Tell us about that first idea. What was it that sort of compelled you to say, well, actually, what compelled you to leave McKinsey?
So that's an interesting. So I was 2+ years into McKinsey,
Right.
And I found myself. I'd redesigned one of our studies was at an insurance company, and I'd redesigned the sales force compensation structure at this insurance company. There was 17 or 18,000 salespeople were about to be impacted by this change that we had, me and a small group of people had come up with, and I was leading the team. And I found myself presenting to the COO, who then went on to become the CEO. And, he's actually listening to me. It's in his boardroom. And I have this out-of-body experience, which is, why are you listening to me? I don't actually know that much about your sector. And I've been...
You're a young 30-year-old?
If that,
Okay.
right? Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Well, I was back then. But I was only 8 months in that sector. And there's something about it that bothered me. We all go through life, and if you're actually paying attention to what's going on, in your mind and in your heart, you will sense moments where there's a disconnect. And often the disconnect speaks to you in frequencies that are so low that we ignore it. Or we put it down saying, I'm just not feeling well.
It doesn't cut through the noise.
Doesn't cut through the noise, or let me distract myself with something else. But I would say you want to tune into those little frequencies, because those are a few pivotal moments where you can actually make some changes. And so for me, it was that sense that there's something wrong here. Nothing I'm doing is that dramatic, yet he's about to go do something. And my insight, when I followed that through, it was actually quite simple. He's listening to McKinsey. I am simply a person that McKinsey has put there that is, in their view, competent enough to do this. And I said, the model works. That's why it works. That's why the consulting model works. You're intelligent, replaceable parts.
You're being humble. Not many people get hired at McKinsey.
Consulting firms in general, the good ones, and there's plenty that get hired, and that didn't sit well with me. So I said, I've got to figure out if I can write my own chapter, or at least my own, if not my own book, at least my own chapter, as opposed to just be part of somebody else's story.
So then what happened?
And so then I thought, me and a friend of mine from Kellogg, who was also at McKinsey, we decided that we should start an alternative medicine company combining the best of the East and the West. And that seemed like a good idea at the time. It actually wasn't. And mostly because that was my second lesson. That's another area that I actually didn't know that much about. And so the thing is, if you haven't marinated in a space for a while, you have no business starting a company in that space, because then you're no different from a professional manager, right? And
what do you miss if you don't have that insight and industry context? What are the risks? What are the pitfalls that you've seen?
I'd say the biggest risk is you don't understand the problems, and if you don't have a visceral understanding of the problems, if it doesn't, all problems begin here, and then they've got to sort of move down. It's there's an old African saying where the runners would say that until your knowledge lives in your muscles, it doesn't exist.
I love it. I've never
Right?
heard that.
If it doesn't live in your muscles, it doesn't exist. And Farouk is here somewhere. Farouk and I play a lot of squash together. It's like battles forever. But right, you would agree. I mean, unless like what we do lives in the muscles,
Right.
when you need to call it up, it's not going to be there, right? And if you have not soaked deep in an industry, insights are only available at depth. They're not available at the surface, or if they are, then they're available to everybody. So there's no distinction. And so if you haven't really sort of gone deep, then you're going to solve either a shallow problem for the customer or something that others can copy. That was it. So in the case of field glass, by the way, I finally did something in an industry that I actually knew something about.
Which was now, remind us, company number what in
Was
your...
second. I mean, the company that I really built and ran was Field Glass for 15 years,
Right.
Which was a cloud software company to help large organizations manage their contingent labor and services. Quinox, I only ran for a year.
Okay.
So that was my sort of my transition. I did it with two friends, and they've been running it. So it's actually turned out okay because they're both alive, and we had swapped out shares.
Got it.
On the off chance that one would succeed. Turns out they're both okay. But with the idea of having insights helps you in the long run because companies are marathons; they're not sprints. And if the idea is relatively shallow or easily copied, well, you might last a year or two or three or four or five, but then if you're not lucky enough to get acquired, you run out of steam.
Sure.
And then there'll come a moment where you're wondering, why did I do this? And I'm literally out of ideas. It's a bad, place to be.
So Jay, at Field Glass, how long did it really take to perfect that idea? Because clearly the market saw that as a very valuable idea and rewarded you guys so.
Eventually, it did. Okay. Not in the beginning. I've been called like every, I had one reviewer 4 or 5 years into this in Europe. I had done a talk on the industry, and I was laying out how I thought it would change. And he was a buyer for a large European company, and and in his notes, he wrote down, he said, he's a very engaging speaker, but I don't know what he's talking about. He sounds like he's from another planet.
Oh, gosh.
So it was, it's a badge of honor. Unless you collect enough of those observations, you're not operating at depth. So
it took about a decade to perfect this model, you think, or?
Well, the elements of the model were put in place in about 2 years, I would say. And then there was the refinement and the sales and so on. So actually, now that you asked that question, when you think of a business model, you have to think of it as having two elements: the thing you're building and the problem that the customer has, right? And the two have to be connected.
Right.
So your product or your company is simply the shadow cast by the customer's problem. You have to see it that way. So just as a shadow of something can never be disconnected from the original thing, right? Those two belong together. If one moves, the other has to move. And so to me, it's always been a good metaphor for building a company, which is you cannot take your eye off the customer's problem. Because what happens is, everyone does that well initially because you don't have a product. But as soon as you have a product, then you start to take your eyes off, and you start to say, well, look how beautiful this is, and this feature and that shiny object and that sort of thing. And meanwhile, that's moved on you.
So that is a real sort of dimensional conflict. Give us some tips. How do you, when you're at that stage where the product's at play and you're being tugged in versus out, how do you sort of stay connected? Give us some pearls there.
It is the central question, by the way, in building a company, the one you just asked. And it really has to reflect in the entire design of your firm. And the way I think of it is you have to make your company porous to the customer's views. And by porous, I mean literally like Swiss cheese. Lots of holes where information can come in and go out. Now that makes people nervous because most of our companies look like sausage factories. It's not pretty inside. You always wait for the product to come out, but don't look inside my sausage factory. But you have to. And we did it by creating very active customer QA boards, advisory boards. We invited them into our shop. We exposed what was wrong with them. And there were times where they would react as you might react when you see, you see blood on the floor, metaphorically. But you have to get through that. And they become your most committed customers when you do that. And the thing is, people don't do that in general. So when you do it, you're already starting to, like I said, get deep and you find insights. And the customers will tell you subtle things like, well, that button doesn't belong there. Or I remember we did a Japanese translation. We had a professional firm do a Japanese translation of the product. And the first customer that saw it started laughing, and he said, some of these words haven't been used since the Second World War.
Archaic Japanese.
Yes.
Right.
And now had we gone live with that product, we would have lost credibility immediately. So it's these nuanced things, you just have to get the customer. And the other tip I'd give you is every employee needs to be a listening post. And the best listening posts are actually a help desk people.
True.
And
It's an intake. It's an intake.
It's an
function,
intake.
Right.
And who calls them? Someone who's got a problem.
The disgruntled ones.
The disgruntled.
Right.
And someone who's got a problem is your best friend, actually.
Absolutely.
Not at that moment.
If you listen.
If you listen.
Right.
So they've got to be a listening post. Most people set up their support centers completely wrong. So they reward them for quick turnaround of the issue.
Right.
Or for having like the smallest problem log or the call log.
Right.
It should be the opposite. Right. It's like, if you're hearing something, I need to know.
Right.
And so we set it up so that there was no clock
Like
running.
how many calls have you done in a day? And you may have pissed off half of them, but you're showing
right.
200 calls.
That's right. And so we never cared about how many calls you did. We just cared about, did you take care of the problem? If it took you 2 hours, fine. And then we connected that people up with our product development group. So while it's fresh, they're hearing what's going on. So there's more, but generally speaking.
I cannot thank you enough. You guys, I'm sure, I'm looking at the audience. They are in a trance listening to you. I love the way
In a good way,
you
hopefully.
No, they're all awake. I love the way that you are, it's chock full of insights. And I love the choice of words. And you're very reflective about and very measured about the words that you use. If you would allow this,
Yeah, sure.
Let's open this up a little bit. And I've got a few more questions, but if you can raise your hands, and we've got folks with microphones ready to go. And let's get a few questions into Jay. And please rise and state your name.
My name is Samina Faruqi, and I hope all of you can hear me. So I have a question. You mentioned that you made your company porous. That's a very good point and important point. But I understand you're in vendor management, but for the companies that have to follow law and rules, like pharmaceuticals or retail, how do they make themselves porous?
So, I won't speak to other industries that I don't know about, but the idea of being porous is to really the customer's problem that you're solving, and you don't have to give up IP. We do have to follow laws too. There are all sorts of laws, but ask yourself, why does my company exist? Why does it exist? It actually exists to solve the problem. It's a commercial relationship with the customer. Your product or service is addressing some issue or problem on the other side. And by porous, all I mean is recognize that problem is going to evolve and shift over time, right? And so the problem looks one way today, tomorrow it looks a different way. Are you keeping track of how that problem is moving around? Or is it even still a problem anymore? Right? There are stories upon stories of how large companies have missed this. Kodak is one of the most famous examples. Kodak went overnight, almost, from a giant success to losing to digital cameras. Do you know who invented the digital camera? It was Kodak.
True.
Kodak invented the digital camera. They had the idea.
And they didn't think it would take.
Well,
right?
someone with probably a big P&L on the film side killed it.
Yes.
Right?
Because that was a core business.
It was their core business. So, one of my other professors, Mohan Sani, always says, you're going to get cannibalized, keep the cannibals in the family.
I love it.
Right?
Love that. What other questions do you have? Let's give other people a chance. There's many hands that are up. Let's get the microphone over.
Hi, my name is Faizan Tai. I'm from Chicago. Question for you, Jay. So I tried to start a couple startups in the past, and where we saw a major disconnect was between the engineering side as well as the delivery side in getting it out to customers. Can you talk about some times where you were, maybe in a rut or maybe in a stressful situation where you had to deliver a product, but didn't quite have the resources to get it done?
That would be all the time, basically. All of product development basically consists of taking 15 pounds of stuff and trying to shove it in a 5-pound bag. That's called a release cycle. That's what it is. There's not a magic solution here, but I'll tell you your product development and delivery conflicts are legion. I mean, they happen all the time. And the way it happens is product development will say, you're asking for this. You haven't even used the last set of features that were a crisis on the last cycle. And delivery will say, well, if your stuff worked like I thought it would, then I wouldn't have to do this, and so on. It goes round and round. And I think there are a few levers that you can use. One of them is, instead of having them like this, like I'm talking to you and we're talking back and forth, you just have to sort of reorient them both so they're not actually facing each other. I mean, as a metaphor, they're actually facing the client. And take them to the client. So it relates to the idea of openness, porosity with the client. When the client comes in, they're not going to fight.
Right.
They're not going to fight. And then they realize that they can actually collaborate in solving the problem together. The greatest gift you can ask your customer is to give you guardianship of their problem. I mean, I would literally say that. It's like, Mr. Customer, give me your problem. Whether I build a feature for it or whether I build a professional services, some service that I built for you, don't worry about how I'm going to solve it. And so it's a reminder that dev and PS are playing on the same team. They're just different positions. I mean, the great metaphors from sports actually apply here, where you have all these different positions here that must play together.
You won't talk about the Cubbies, though, right?
I won't talk about the Cubbies, yeah. No.
Fair. Very good. Other questions? Go ahead, please, sir.
Good morning. My name is Malik Alani. Could you talk a little bit about the role of culture and stories and keeping your employees human instead of becoming very mechanical?
Absolutely. So, the first element of culture comes from the founder, because that's all there is. And people watch and see how you're making decisions, what you're doing with people, so on and so forth. As you add other people, other senior leaders come in, they become the extenders of the culture. And I think the founder's job then becomes making sure everyone understands what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And then coming down hard when that happens. For instance, if there's in our journey of 15 or so years, we saw everything. Right? It becomes a microcosm. We saw, mostly very, very good behavior, but we saw things that led, a couple of cases, instant terminations. Mm-hmm. And you have to be willing to do that, even if that person is absolutely key to you. You have a great relationship, because people are watching that as a culture. The second thing I'll say is the physical space informs culture and vice versa. And I just have a quick anecdote on this. We had the opportunity to design out our brand new office from a concrete floor. And we built out the office, and I sat with the architect and I told them, I'd like a space that reflects our culture. Mm-hmm. And she says, what is your culture? So I said, well, it's this, this, and this. And someone else said, well, what about, I said it's transparency, a sense of collaboration, integrity. And someone else said, well, what about fun?
Right.
And we're like, well, we can't leave out fun,
of course
because
not.
fun's important. And when we're done with this, and this lady knew exactly what she had started here, because she wanted us to get to a point where we are in agreement on what this is.
She was forcing you to articulate that which had not been articulated.
Which had not been articulated.
Right.
And she said, you guys actually have a great culture. But if you're asking me to have the physical space reflect it, then you need to get together and decide what it is. And it can't be 100 things. It's got to be a few things. And so we went through this amazing exercise where the real value of it is the exercise. True. Of getting people from different tenure or seniorities groups together.
Well, this is a great environment.
It's
1871 that you all have built, right?
Yes, it's beautiful.
And how has that impacted, you think, the incubation process? Do you think that there's a correlation there?
There is, because, if you walk around this place, and there's a floor above that we just extended that Howard was briefly mentioning, the area has lots of visual elements that give you, they're like billiard balls, right? So they bounce around. And so you're looking for things to interact with, things that sort of reshape your consciousness in the moment. It's a floor space where you can, it's designed for accidentally running into other people. It's designed to be welcoming. And, if you're talking about transparency and collaboration, you can't do better than this. There are no walls, offices, there's no barriers, right? Even the private offices have all glass walls, which suggest welcoming and, but privacy only from a sound perspective. And so spaces, sorry for the long answer, but culture and your physical workspace actually become inextricable.
Wonderful. Got a few other hands at the back. I want to be democratic here. If our folks can move to the back, and maybe take one question in the middle and then get at the back. This is fantastic. This is exactly the kind of conversation we were envisioning, and you've over-delivered on that. You can stop.
Thank you.
Just kidding. Is that good? Let's go to another microphone. All right.
How's that? Much better. So Raheel Redewala, it's great to have you here. I have a question. You mentioned this idea of knowing the problem. Specific to the industry that you started Fieldglass in, which is contract staff management. How important was knowing the problem? And then how many times did you have to modify your business model to allow successful sales to happen? It's pretty complex to actually convince somebody to do a cloud platform for a contract management solution. So
that's an excellent question, actually. It allows me to flesh out this insight point that I wanted to make. So we were the 5th company to start, maybe the 6th in this space. So we were not the first by any means. By the time I started the company, it was already an industry, right? It was not I didn't know it at that time. I might have never started it, but that's what it was. So there's a lesson here, which is you don't have to be the first. You just have to be better than others and over a period of time. Now, the idea of managing a large contract workforce is well known to everybody. Many of us have that background. But I had to sit down and study the business models of the first 5 startups and conclude that they would fail in a particular way. So the insight here is, if you show me, if you look at a business model, the way you might succeed and the way you might fail is already written in it. It's already written in it. And so as an example, one of the early competitors was, they were a collection of procurement experts. And they came in and said, we're procurement experts. And so we built out software that reflects the best of procurement. Sounds like a valid argument. But if you think of the negative space, which is the reverse of it, so you're telling me how you're going to succeed, which means you're also telling me how you're going to fail. And as an entrepreneur, you have to start looking for what is not being said. Like, don't look at the positive form of what you're showing me, but let me look at what you're not telling me. And in this case, casting this purely as a procurement problem was a total mistake. And they didn't last very long. They lasted 2 years. Someone else set it up as an exchange, like we'll do an exchange. And there was another person that said, well, we're the best software builders. We're from Silicon Valley, so we'll have the best software. Each of these, if we had more time, we can talk about how they would fail. And it actually turned out that that's how they failed. Your business model is sort of a piece of clay that is slowly starting to harden, but you have a year or 2 to actually shape it. And that's how you should see a business model. It's not something you get right on day 1, but it's something that you have to get the broad brushstrokes of it right.
Right.
But then be able to sort of adjust on the edges here.
So, boy, we could do this all day long. This has been so wonderful, and I know many people in the audience have questions, but we may need to leave the questions at
Sure.
this. But I do want to end with just some thoughts from you. As you know, this platform is primarily serving diaspora immigrant folks in the entrepreneurial sector, and much is made of, is the entrepreneur experience different for immigrant entrepreneur experience? And I haven't come to a clear answer on this, but I would love as a successful immigrant entrepreneur, if you can share your perspectives on it.
Is it different for immigrants?
Is it or is it the same? Is it easier? Is it more difficult? Or it
it's-
shouldn't matter?
I think it's more difficult, which actually makes it easier.
Please
So
explain.
if you think about that for a
Right.
second, it is more difficult up front because you come here. It's a strange country. You know, I came here when I was 22, and I remember landing at Atlanta airport after a connection from New York. You're sitting in tight economy class. You're just wiped out. And I
Been there.
remember we've all been there. And I remember looking at a Coke machine, one of those machines. It was an older machine, so there were no instructions. Apparently, you need instructions for a Coke machine, but I literally did not know how to operate that thing.
Wow.
I didn't know there were holes and buttons, and it was. I still think of that as a metaphor for, stranger in a strange land, type of situation. So, I think, an immigrant. If they come to a country the way most of us did, which is not with very much, but with an education and some hope, your mindset is one of you start to switch up, which is, this is not going to be easy. I don't know the culture. I don't know the people. I don't really have much money. My job may not last very long. That part is very difficult, and so it forces you to develop a mindset and skills of survival. And I've got to be twice as good to be perceived as half as good, type of thing, which then later makes it easier because you've had training in a sense. Back to our athlete example, those who train perform better. An immigrant experience is training.
True.
With someone who's grown up in a sleepy suburb, I'm Mary Jane from Main Street. Nothing against Mary Janes from Main Street, but they may not have had that experience.
So that discipline is a positive thing, you're saying?
It's a
an
positive thing.
advantage.
The difficulty is what makes it easier.
I see. I get what you're saying. Wow.
Thank you.
I cannot thank you enough. I want to thank our board member, Farooq Khan, for introducing you to us. I hope that you will stay connected with Open Chicago.
I will.
And let us know you heard about our mission of what we're trying to do. And we would love to have more input and guidance from you on how we can amplify what we are trying to do in Chicago.
It sounds it's a great group. My only advice would be you should all buy a few T-shirts.
I knew that was coming. Thanks again.